Hello, everybody. Welcome to my talk. I am Brenda. I'm one of the founders of Tellor. And today, Tellor is a decentralized oracle. We're probably one of the probably only oracle that can actually pass the walkaway test. We've been live since 2019. Staking, disputes, requesting data, all happens on chain. And we've been doing that since the beginning. But today I'm not here to talk about Tellor. I'm here to talk about who holds the truth on Ethereum. So we're going to talk a little bit about how data flows through the system, because ultimately that's what ends up dictating what kind of outcomes we get on chain. And the way the data flows also ends up creating sometimes unintended consequences, because the data can be and is and has been sometimes manipulated. So if I spend too much time on that aspect of the presentation, just somebody wave at me, because it's super interesting, but it's actually what makes the point of what is how this actually works. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about how data actually flows into the system, because I realized yesterday that maybe the flow needed to be improved. So in general, when you're trying to observe the vulnerabilities of your system, you do this map where you actually see where data moves. And then based on that map, which is generally a lot more complex than this is a very simplified version of that, you can identify, based on how it moves, where are the vulnerabilities and the weaknesses, or the places where it can actually be attacked. So this is a very, very big overview of it, where I'm just looking at data definitions. So like all of us here know, blockchains can't really access data from off-chain, so they have to get it from somewhere. But before it even gets there, there's got to be some sort of definition for it. So generally for pricing information, or even for an event like did Zelensky wear a suit, you have to ask a question, and there's got to be some sort of definition that defines what a suit is, or some sort of interpretation that maybe people might take, and it could be different than what was intended. But in general, for pricing, you're going to have these three main parts of that definition. Is there enough liquidity? You make an assumption on that. You prescribe a type of aggregation. And then you also assume that this asset is going to be listed on all of these different exchanges, or it's going to be available on all of these different sources. And those are the initial assumptions that you might make, and then you go to an oracle provider and you're like, this is what I want. Or maybe you just use some random feed that a lot of the oracle providers, we provide a lot of free feeds on chain. A lot of them are for blue chip assets, mostly. And people sometimes, they just use it because it's free. They're already on chain, and they already have a sort of a cycle of time that they're loaded. So it's cheap. But if you want something more custom, this is generally what you would do. You come up with a definition, you tell them what you want. And then the second part of it, as you're designing your protocol, obviously you're excited about the great things that you're doing within your protocol. And then at some point you do think really hard about how to implement your oracle within your system. And when you go through that, you can actually choose from a wide array of oracles. We have everything from centralized oracles to decentralized oracles. And there's always a trade-off. There is no right or bad answer to this, or choosing wrong. It just depends on what are your priorities and what you are willing to trade off. If you go for a more centralized oracle, you're assuming or you're accepting the choke points. If you go with a more decentralized oracle, you're accepting that it's going to be a bit slower, because this just takes longer to reach it's the trilemma applies to chains, just like it applies to oracles. So that's where you have to make your trade-offs there. You choose something, you choose someone, and then you implement this function that generally allows you to get data, whether you pull data from a contract from one of the oracles, or they push data onto your contract. And basically there you're making the decision of who gets to decide how often and when you get data. And you can reach agreements, either off-chain, or maybe run some infrastructure to make sure that it gets updated when price change happens or you have a heartbeat on it. But ultimately, this function just determines who gets to decide when that information comes. And we'll go through some examples of how that can have an impact on what happens on your protocol. But then after that, the data is like, okay, you get data from the outside world. There's some aggregations that happen. Then the Oracle protocol relays it onto chain, and then you actually get to consume it. So that's the other portion where like, okay, so when you consume, what kind of triggers, what kind of things are triggered, and what kind of outcomes come out of that, right? And then that's pretty much where your data ends up being, and from there you can decide, or you can start seeing where things can start to break down. And for us, it's actually very difficult because we operate on an open system, so we don't always know all the parties that are participating, and there's not always the possibility of suing somebody to get your money back. TradFi operates in a closed system, and it's very easy to find out where the money went, who's at fault, and if you can't recover it, they can always go to jail. For us, as we've seen year after year and hack after hack, that is not always the case. We just don't have that available to us. It's not part of our current infrastructure. And so every little decision that you make from, are you going to use a decentralized oracle or a centralized oracle? So you want something fast, you want something slow. You're making a trade-off. It's not that it's wrong or it's right. You're making a trade-off. So if you wait too long to get information that is more robust, then you risk settling on more stale information. And if you act very quickly, then you risk having the asset being manipulated. Also, then depending on your definition, you might choose to have a market price or a fundamental or a fixed price, like we've seen in a couple of recent cases where prices of an expected stablecoin have been hard-coded to one, and then that expectation broke, and it caused all sort of havoc. So it's a lot harder for us to actually do what TradFi does. So with that in mind, I'm going to go through a couple of examples that we've seen in the last year. Actually, these are all from last year, but there's plenty of other examples from other years as well. But these just really exemplify how there's really no easy answer of one size fits all. So last October, when they announced the tariffs in the US, it caused all sorts of economic waves around the world, including in crypto. And in crypto, what ended up happening, for some reason, everything moved, but Ethereum, which acts as a stable coin as well, they had a depeg, but they worked as they're supposed to, as expected. They have liquidations, redemptions, and minting, and the mechanism went back and rebalanced itself pretty quickly, everywhere except in Binance. So in this example, they acted very siloed. Within Binance, for some reason that I cannot comprehend, they decided to use their order book as their oracle. And it had very thin liquidity, and they ended up experiencing a lot more liquidations than anywhere else in the system. And also, if you think about it, that's also a very centralized oracle. It was a choice that they made, but it was a choice that obviously made it very, very clear that there was something wrong and something different in the system. And they went back and gave most people their money back. But I think that was probably the reason that they did that is because it was so obvious that everything was fine outside of their system that they had to. The second example is an example where they actually talked to each other too quickly, or not too quick, as expected, but having that connection be that quick actually ended up causing an unintended consequence. So Elixir is dead now, but last summer, at the beginning of last summer, they had a manipulation attack where somebody found a curve pool with really low liquidity and did a 210K trade that moved the price of that liquidity pool. And even though they were using an aggregated price, different sources, it managed to move the price, and Chainlink got it. They did what they needed to do. They did exactly what they were expected to do. They relayed that information to Avalanche, where then more than 500,000 were liquidated. And so in this case, they just used basically a market price that it was ultimately manipulated. But then to kind of fix that, they went back. So Morpho, Euler, and Elixir actually fixed XUSD to be equal to 1 on their systems and sort of mitigate this kind of attack, because now if there was a flash loan, or a flash crash, that wouldn't affect their system, right? And so something external to on-chain happened. Their fund manager actually reported 93 million loss, and so they obviously depegged in the real world because they just didn't have that money anymore. But because they were hard-coded at 1, only redemptions were allowed and liquidations weren't. So all the LPs were left with really bad debt. And then Elixir died. That was pretty much it for them. These two examples, I think, just really, really exemplify like how there is no right or wrong answer, and it is a hard problem to solve. Moonwell, I think they ended up getting like a really high price for Ethereum, like 2 million or something like that, instead of like 3,000 or something along those lines. And apparently there was a conversion issue. It wasn't super clear as to what happened. And then Resolve, unfortunately, they had somebody get access to one of their private keys through an AWS server. They minted a bunch of USR and ended up basically, so two things happen here. So the private key, then the role that that private key held, the service role, was allowed to actually input the conversion. So even though the attacker only did like deposits of about 100 and 200K, they were able to mint instead of 1-to-1. I think they ended up minting about 80 million and then running away with about 23. And because a lot of the vaults on, I think it was Morpho and Fluid, had a USR hard-coded to 1, they were also able to just run away with a bunch of money. But this just happened last week, so I need to go back and really read the deep dive, but that was basically what I found so far. And all this to say that the way that they operated, you know, they have a data definition, they had their Oracle, they had their protocol, you know, the data flew properly, but ultimately there were a few places where this data flow failed. And so when we talk about who holds the truth, well, that depends on how it flows as well, right? So right here, and in the Binance attack was low liquidity, or it's not. It wasn't. I don't know that it was an attack, but on the faulty mechanism, on the Elixir one, that was low liquidity. When you have a definition for information that you're absorbing or consuming, there's got to be monitors to those assumptions because things change. You know, chains get compromised, private keys get compromised, assets get delisted. So it's not a thing that you just do once and you don't look back. It's something that you have to continue to monitor day and night pretty much to make sure that those assumptions continue to hold. Another place where they actually didn't do a good job was with their fallbacks. There's different fallbacks that you can have for different types of hacks or defaults. They're not things that you implement after the fact. These are things that you have to think about way before when you're actually designing your protocol as part of your Oracle implementation, because the Oracle implementation is not just that one function that absorbs information, but it's all of that we just saw as how data flows. So you can limit the change on the asset. Obviously, that has a trade-off because then now you're limiting losses, but you're also limiting gains You have to be very, very good at disclosing those kinds of things to your consumers. You can have an oracle delay. We have OEV, MEV, so there's another trade-off that you're doing there. But then again, you make sure that when the information comes in, by the time that you use it, it's actually good information. Maker had a 1 hour delay for many, many years. I don't know if they still have it with Sky, but they are one of the biggest DeFi protocols out there that has survived time after time, and they were able to afford that. I think that was a very, very good thing to do. You can also pretend like nothing happens, unless there's a pretend like nothing happens and just hold withdrawals. Sure, we'll say that this is real, but you can't withdraw for an hour. And then if there's a dispute, maybe you can do something to address it. And like that, you have to think about all of this way before. Monitors, you really just have to be constant in evaluating whether your aggregation is still valid. And for that, it's very easy monitors, to be honest. Or you could even if they were the most basic monitors, it could actually give you a hint when something's going wrong. To put it all together, this is basically the flow of the data. And ultimately, the ultimate backstop that we actually have of who controls what happens is your community, because ultimately you can't fork, especially if you structure your protocol in a way that you can freeze balances and things like that. But you have to think about those in advance. There's a lot of other hacks out there, and they continue to happen. It's kind of sad that we continue to make the same mistakes again. A lot of them are pretty much the same things over and over. But something else that I want to talk about is how maintaining or losing credible neutrality can be a very dangerous thing to do. Obviously, I am not saying Hyperliquid did anything wrong when they actually overrode their oracle to protect their users with the jelly attack. Basically, one of their markets was manipulated, and it was getting to the point where it was going to start eating into their vault. And then Binance and a few other big exchanges decided to add to the fire by listing that asset on their chain. And so Hyperliquid said, no, we're going to defend our ecosystem. They backtracked everything. We didn't know that they could do that until then. And this is really dangerous, because things that can happen, or they can be coerced into, now we could think that they could be coerced into doing something that a government wants. This specific example here with USDC coin actually depegged in 2023 was because at that time, the U.S. government was doing the Operation Choke Point 2.0, where they were pretty much trying to take away any banking services to crypto founders. And they managed to close down Silvergate and Silicon Valley Bank. And Silicon Valley Bank held a lot of the reserves, or not a lot, actually. It was actually not that much of the reserves of USDC, but they held some. And just because of that, people panicked and started selling, because they thought they weren't going to be able to get their money out of the system into fiat. So this really matters, because whether we want to accept it or not, it is what happens politically inside and outside of the ecosystem actually can have an effect on what actually controls the truth on Ethereum. And as we see institutions come into Ethereum and become a bigger part than they already are, it's going to, that tension is going to be felt more, because they are too big to fail for governments to let them fail. And I wonder if we're going to be able to maintain our credible neutrality to make sure that they are also, or that they are not counted as too big to fail. That balance needs to be there between the community, the validators, the oracles, the decentralized protocols. But it is very difficult to say that as they come in and they take over the majority of the market, or a big portion of the market, that they're not going to have a say on what happens. And this is what makes it even more important that we, as a community, and with the infrastructure technically as well, the technical infrastructure, we make it so that that is not possible, because there's always going to be somebody trying to pull those levers when something goes wrong. And so, who holds the economic truth on Ethereum? You know what? That's a really loaded question. I think there's a lot of things that we could do to make sure that the truth is actually reflected. TradFi, I know that's a picture. It's not that great, but it actually has a hierarchical system. You have courts. You know how the system works. In DeFi, you're always trying to figure out how to make it work. And I think it's a question that is worth asking, no matter what you're building, to make sure that we build with that kind of mindset moving forward, and that we continue to survive governments, whether they're friendly or not, as an industry overall. And with that, I ran out of time, I believe. So if you guys have any questions, happy to. Oh, I think I got out.
So what do you do when you have a lending protocol and say you have a reliable oracle and there's volatility, the price crashes, your oracle is reporting the good price, but the gas prices are so high, so no liquidator is liquidating, and you end up with bad debt anyway.
Yeah, so that actually happened on Black Thursday. At that point, I think it was a mishap. One of the things that you could have done with Tellor is you could have paid more, tip higher, so that you would cover the gas cost, and then you would have gotten the information. But a lot of oracles is automated infrastructure. So if they can get in, they can get in. But if you are able to have a mechanism to actually tip them on top so that you can pay the cost of that gas cost, you could probably get in some information in. But that same attack vector was recreated on Levana protocol on Osmosis chain, because that's one of the trade-offs that we do when we go to a chain that's also cheaper. It's also cheaper to attack. It's also cheaper to do a DDoS attack. And I've only observed it once at the Levana protocol. I imagine that that's going to happen a lot more often, but I haven't heard of any other similar ones. But yeah, they basically recreated Black Thursday. And yeah, it's one of those things that you just have to have infrastructure in place. All righty, well, thank you so much, everyone.